Thank you everyone for being here with us this afternoon. Thank you very much to the Matcha Initiative and the Transmutation Principle for organizing this event and for having us. Yes, the slides are with me. Excellent. So before I go into the content and the context of how are we estimating all the dollar values and associated costs and benefits for infrastructure investments under a changing climate, I'd just like to set the tone with a personal story to tell you why I do what I do. So growing up, sustainability and climate risk have been sort of dinner time conversations for me. When I was growing up in India, every rainy season I would get caught in a flood in Mumbai city. Sometimes it would just be a nice splash of water that the bus does, and sometimes it would be a little bit more dangerous, where we would have to stay home from school, and you had to be safe, and you couldn't really, your lives were disrupted for a couple of days. And so I was very aware, and I was very exposed to this topic that these risks are real, and also that it impacts a lot of stuff around us. So about how many years has it been? About 20 years ago, when I thought about what am I going to study, it was very clear. I was going to be an engineer, and I was going to use technologies and strategies, and I was going to build better cities, cities that don't flood, cities that don't blow away in storms and hurricanes, and I was going to do this perfectly with the best technology available. But as I went to engineering school, I started studying all of this. I did my bachelor's, I did my master's, and somewhere in the middle I realized that these technologies exist. They have existed for years, but they just haven't been implemented. Then I came to Singapore and I saw that, okay, maybe it is governance and policy that pushes this step forward, right? Where a government can choose to build adaptation plans, choose to spend $8 billion building flood walls, and maybe that was the reason. So I went to the School of Public Policy, and I did a minors in water policy and governance, and I started to sort of get this picture a little bit more. But through this process, as I spoke to more policymakers and I spoke to engineering consultancies, and I started to try to continue on my venture to make the world a better place, I realized another missing piece of the puzzle, which was the economics of it all. Right? Things don't get built if they're not funded. And that's how I ended up in sustainable finance. So for about 10 years now, I have been trying to make the case for investing in more sustainable infrastructure. As we've been hearing this morning, and I guess this whole week, about the adaptation gap, right? So for mitigation, the gap is about $9 trillion for the next 2 decades. And for adaptation, it's about, I think I heard, if I remember the number correctly, about $380 billion just for developing countries. And about 2/3 of this has to come from the private sector. So we have to convince private investors to spend trillions of dollars over the next 20 years to invest in infrastructure that keeps our cities running, that keeps our lives running. And that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years, trying to estimate not only the costs of action, but the costs of inaction, so as to convince people to invest in something. And what I have learned in my experience, that having these numbers and having this data is great, but if you don't have this in a way that's systematic, comparable, and global, it makes it very difficult to make an investment case. So over the next 35 minutes that I have with you, I would like to show you how we approach the infrastructure asset class and how we try to make these data points and decisions comparatively across all types of assets. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the problem of climate risk and infrastructure. We'll talk about how we approach this quantification. How do we do this systematically across the world? And finally, a call of action as to how all of you can try to incorporate this in your companies, in your cities, back in your world. I would be amiss not to introduce my organization before I jump into the actual content of it. So I have been working for the past 5 years in a firm that we call Scientific Infra and Private Assets. This firm itself is a research institute that has been in Singapore for about 10 plus years, focused on infrastructure investments. Our parent is the edX Business School, which thought about 10 years ago to focus research on infra investments, and that's how we were born. And over the past few years, we've had a few rebrandings. So what we do very well, I don't know if any of you are users of our data, is we build financial indices that benchmark the valuation of private infrastructure assets globally. And 5 years ago, we started our journey on ESG, so the green infrastructure team, on how can we understand and qualify the environmental, social, and governance risks and impacts for infra assets, which is the team that I'm part of. So let's jump right in. What is the biggest problem at the moment for everyone in this room, globally, like generally, from a more macro perspective, right? It's this. It's a climate emergency. And I don't think I need to introduce this audience to why climate emergency is relevant, why it's important. It's there, it's everywhere, it's here, and it's now. And this drives a lot of stuff, right? Climate change is going to cause biodiversity loss, climate change is going to break roads, it's going to damage airports, it's going to have buildings falling down, we're going to have forest fires, we're going to lose so many species to climate risk, properties will become uninsurable, there'll be deaths because of forest fires and wildfires, the agriculture sector will be important. It is everywhere. And at the center of this lies infrastructure. Not because I work in infrastructure, but also because infrastructure underpins how the planet moves, how we do what we do. It is pipelines that bring us water. It's electricity networks that power our homes. It is ports and airports that enable shipping. So the infrastructure sector, like it all, sits in the middle of the problem and of the solution as to how we react to climate change. Because if you think about it, infra is big. It's a huge asset that costs so much money. It is where it is, and it does what it does. A coal power plant will burn coal. Yes, you can have extensive retrofits, but it will burn coal. And if you have a carbon tax, it will be taxed. A road is where it is. If there's a flood, it's going to flood, and that's it. So in the case of infra, we're sort of married to these risks, and we have to adapt, and these risks are very real and very big. So for example, we did these studies over the past couple of months, and we came to these big numbers. So if you have an infrastructure portfolio only, one step back. So we track at the moment about 9,000 infrastructure assets globally. We know what their financial value is, we know what their risks are, we know where they are and what they do, and a lot of things about these 9,000 assets. And for these 9,000 assets, we know that in a hothouse scenario, where everything is up and burning in the air, it could cost me as much as 54% of my portfolio value. For a private investor, that's a very high number. And in terms of transition risks, this portfolio could also rack up losses of about $600 billion. That's 30% of my entire value of my 9,000 assets across the infrastructure I hold globally. These are very big risks, and when you're invested in these type of assets, these risks are your risks. Because, yeah, you can divest away, but typically infra investors have 10-year horizons, and they are part of these funds that last you 20, 25 years. So it is out of the question that if they should adapt, they have to adapt. The question becomes how. And people are very aware of these risks. Yeah? So when we had a survey last year where we asked a lot of our clients, about 100, 200 asset owners and asset managers, what do they use non-financial data for? So if they use ESG data or risk data, what is it for? And resoundingly across the world, the first reason they need data for is risk management. More precisely, to manage their transition risks and physical risks. And if you notice here, that number is a lot higher for Asia than anything else. And this complements what Thibaut said this morning about Asian cities and Asian countries being more exposed to this risk than other places. You need this data for risk management, but does it exist? Everybody says, so 97% of our investors believe that climate risk is significant. About 2/3 of them expected this to have a medium or high impact on their portfolio. But what about the data that you need to do something about this? Interestingly, only 16% of the people said that they have the data or they know what they have to look at to do something about this. Now, this is a mismatch, right? So there are very high stakes at one end, and on the other end, there is no data to do something about it. So really, that's the problem. So you have climate risk, which is big and macro, but how do you address it? One of the main solutions here, or a problem here, is the lack of data. And that's where we come in, to quantify climate risk for the infrastructure asset class. Now, I have heard this time and again. There are so many data providers out there that give you so much risk data. But for this particular problem, to know what do I invest in, and if I'm invested in, what are my risks, what do they look like, what data do people actually need? What do you need to know about, say, an asset that you hold? You need to know what its risk exposure is. So is it flood, is it storm, when is it coming, how is it coming? You need to know how much it will cost you, and you also need to know what you can do about it. Right? And that's, this is not a good contrast, but that is really a short part of the story. Now, if you want to know what your risk is, you don't just, what do you mean exactly by what your risk is? You need to know both what the transition risk is and what the physical risk is. You need to know that you have measured it systematically in a scientifically robust way. You need to know that you've captured not only the systematic risk. So for example, if you're near an area which is flood prone, it doesn't mean that you will flood. If you have a flood wall or you're elevated, you won't. So you need to capture the risk systematically plus idiosyncratically, and you need to do this in a way that's comparable across geographies, across sectors. Once you know what your risk is, you need to know how much it's going to cost you. What is the financial materiality of this risk? Do I care? Can I insure myself against it? Is it too small to change my bottom line and my outlook towards this? So from an asset value perspective, what is my financial materiality of it? Not only today, but also in the future. Is this a big enough number for me to do something about this today, tomorrow, in 2030, 2050? What does this mean? How does this evolve? And once I know my risk, once I know how much it's going to cost me, then I need to know what can I do about it, right? So how do I adapt? How do I build resilience vis-a-vis how much is this going to cost me? How does this all come together? So I can tell you all of this about infrastructure because as a firm, we have been working in infrastructure for a very long time. And there are three key pieces of information or three key databases that I want to introduce you to before I go down to how I actually solve this problem. So first, I need to know what infrastructure is. So when I say I deal with infrastructure, I deal with all types of infrastructure. And if you really think about it, a road is very different from an airport, which is very different from a solar plant, which is very different from a pipeline. And in order to make an assessment of these risks systematically across all of these asset classes, first I need to differentiate them. I need to characterize it, right? So I need to know what category does my infrastructure belong to. So at the finest level, we classify infrastructure into 101 different types, and we build this information for these 101 types of assets. In addition to this, there are also three other pillars that we use to classify infra, which is the business risk. Is it corporate? Is it merchant? Is it regulated? Does it really face a regulatory risk or not? It depends on how the company is set up. It's geoeconomic classes, so is it regional? Is it local? Where does it work? The next piece of information I want to know is what are these impacts and risks and how are they related? So an infrastructure company being at the center, due to its activities, it has some impacts. It has some emissions, right? That causes climate change. It provides services which improves the quality of life of some people. At the same time, it faces risks. So climate change will cause a carbon tax, which will cause a transition risk on these companies. People might not like it. There may be reputational risk associated. So you have to know what the dichotomy of these risks are. How are they related? How they all move together? And finally, the third piece of information that I want to tell you before jumping into how to quantify these risks is infratech. So given these 101 types of infrastructure classes, given all of these assets that exist, is there a way that I know the key strategies and technologies they can apply? So for example, if I pick up a TCFD report and an airport tells me they've changed all their light bulbs to LED, yay! Does it matter? Not really. What is that, 1%, 2% of their overall emissions? So how do you know what actually pushes the needle? That's the Infratech database. So we collect for each of the 101 type of infrastructure assets a list. It's a very simple list of how do they decarbonize their scope 1 emissions, their scope 2 emissions, their scope 3 emissions, how do they build flood resilience, heat resilience, wind resilience, storm resilience, how effective are each of these strategies and how much do they cost? And this is a very heavy piece of work. This has been heavily peer-reviewed. There are 1,000+ strategies. We've reviewed over 200+ academic papers, technical documents, government reports, and we have a peer review process in place to ensure the relevance of this database at all given points of time. So now that I know what infrastructure is like, what its impacts and risks are, how do they relate to each other, and what strategies can be used to reduce these risks, can I go back to this? Now I can start to approach the process of finding my risk exposure, finding how much it'll cost me, and then trying to say what I can do about it. So let's jump right in. Just a side note here, I will be presenting the big approach that we have. My colleague Qinyu will be presenting the nitty-gritties and all technical details on exactly how these models work, etc. So when you think about transition risk, it has two types of risks, right? Policy risk and reputation risk. And we've spoken about this morning as well. So given that you have an infrastructure company, it has some emissions. These emissions are increasingly being taxed. That is the policy risk component of these emissions. And in addition to this, the emissions of a company also bring about a certain sentiment from the society, right? That is the reputation risk that emissions evolve. So this follows the TCFD classification of how do you approach transition risks from a policy and reputation perspective. So when we want to go about and estimate this or understand the risk value from a financial perspective, that is my value at risk, you can either use reported data, so you have reported emissions, your scope 1 and 2 emissions, which we build using models. My colleague is behind, who builds these models for us. So you have, sorry, I jumped a gun. So first, you either have reported emissions, you apply the national carbon tax applicable to the country that asset is located in, and you have an understanding of the policy risk score. If you don't have the emissions, which is very probable in the current setting, I am sure this will evolve over the next few years as sustainability reporting improves, its capacity and quality. We will have more and more reported information. But until then, we have to use models and estimates. So in the case where a reported emission value is missing, we start with modeled estimates. Those are the models I was talking about that my colleague behind builds. So you have your scope 1 and 2 emissions that we model using sector-specific models, using everything we know about the infrastructure asset class and its characteristics. We then apply our decarbonization technologies to this. So when you model something, when you estimate something, you begin from macro characteristics, right? So either you go away, like this is a company, this was its electricity bill, which computes to so much emissions, or this was a company, it produced so much output, and typically it takes you 20 grams per ton to produce this level of output. You do these large level calculations. But these are not always perfect, right? So given a company is producing 100 tons of output, if you just use the grid emissions and multiply it by that, yeah, you have an answer which is okay. But you might not know what this company is exactly doing. Maybe they're using renewable energy for part of their process. Maybe they have very efficient processes that doesn't actually produce so much emissions per ton. That's where our second step of idiosyncratic risks come in. So knowing what the company does, we can adjust these sector-specific models to present a better value of better estimate of its emissions. So once you have that, once you have your modeled emissions, you adjust it by the decarbonization level that the company achieves because of strategies it applies. You can then do the same. You add it with carbon tax, you look at and then it gives you the policy risk score. But you can't use any models, right? Your models, again, have to be scientifically robust. They need to give you, it has to be a good model. It can't be a crap model. You can't just estimate something, right? And we go through a validation and a robustness process very seriously. So we look at our models and we look at their performance. And our models perform pretty well across all our 8 sectors. There is very little error. There are, of course, some sectors that perform better than the other, but that is just the nature of estimations. Okay, I think it's working. So once you have those models, coming back to this, we use the decarbonization technologies from the Infra database. This has to be coupled with inputs from the company. So either through I can read a sustainability report and I can process what they've done and adjust my models, or a company itself can get in touch with us and tell us what they've done, and we adjust the emission estimates accordingly, which gives us a policy risk score. So to estimate the policy risk, there are 2 things you can do, right? As this is just a summary of what I said. Either you have reported data, you combine it with carbon tax, and it gives you a policy risk score, or you have model data that you combine then with your decarbonization strategies and technologies. You adjust it based on what the company does, and you get a policy risk score. Now, this was the case of scope 1 and 2 emissions. Now, when we have scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we want to translate this to a value of risk, carbon tax seems to be the most probable proxy or an estimate in order to do this. But what do you do with scope 3 emissions? It's a very debatable topic. It's everywhere. How do we first measure scope 3 emissions, and how do we include them in our models? That's what we do using sector reputation scores. So a company, depending on where it is and what it does, can have very different types of scope 3 emission profiles. And it's incredibly difficult to model this. In fact, this is one of our research priorities for the next couple of years, to build better and more robust scientific models for scope 3 emissions. For now, we do not use reported scope 3 emissions given the uncertainty. Going back to the beginning of my deck, we want to build data that is comparable. And if I have emissions modeled with completely different methodologies, I cannot build comparable estimates. And given the uncertainty and the different ranges in how people estimate scope 3, for now, we only use scope 3 estimates that we model. Are they perfect? Probably not, but they're comparable. And that is fit for the purpose that I need it for, which is to make comparative investment decisions. So I have scope 3 models. Now, say you're a company located in a country where nobody cares about what your emissions are, right? If you emit what you do, but nobody cares, nobody talks about it, the regulator doesn't care, the people doesn't care, do you really have any financial risk from it? Probably not, right? You'll do what you do. There is no financial risk that can manifest into a physical risk. But say you are a certain type of activity and people really don't like it. So you're a coal power plant, and increasingly there is so much negative attention around power plants. They shut down. I mean, we have these coal power plants phased out. And this is very important for the infrastructure asset class, where social acceptance and social acceptability is a very problematic topic. So when you have scope 3 emissions, how do I translate it to a value, a dollar value of risk? I do that using the reputation. So in-house, we build our attention models, where we use 4.2 million news articles. As of this morning, 9 million news articles across 3,000 plus sources. We look for every infrastructure asset class. I know the topics that people talk about, negatively, positively, and we match them. And with that, for different infra sectors across different countries and different locations, I know what my attention weight is. So I take my scope 3 emissions, I weight it with sector reputation, and that gives me a reputation risk score. And combining my reputation risk score and transition risk, reputation risk score and policy risk score, can I now know what my transition risk looks like? For physical risk, again, it is a similar approach. So we know where our company is. We know where these assets are located. Now, something that we've done, and I'm very proud of personally, this is Qinyu's work, who's going to present this later, is we have detailed asset boundaries, so detailed shapes of all of these different assets. And these are available, these are in-house, so we have these shapes. We put them in a model. We have hazard maps built in-house using lots and lots of open source data, using some third-party data. Again, Qinyu will explain this properly in the next session. I'm not going to encroach on that. So you have a company, you have its shapefile, you have the hazard map, and then using something called as damage function, so which is a relationship between the extent of the hazard and the dollar value lost because of it. And again, these hazard maps are very different for different types of infrastructure assets. These are very different for different classes of events and different hazard events. We can then translate to a physical risk score. So at the moment, we do this for flood risk, for storm risk, for wildfire risk, and for heat risk. And again, we adjust this value by the company's strategies. So for example, if you're located in a flood-prone area, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll flood. You may have a flood wall, you may have elevated, you may have bigger drainage systems. So systematically, the hazard might tell you have a flood, but really in reality, you might not. So we take that into account by looking at the resilience strategies. This is just again to show the scientific robustness of our approach. So when you have the geolocation of the asset, we don't just put a point and put a circle around it and said, the asset is here, 50 meters around. It's not a buffer type of analysis. It is a true outlining, a painstaking outlining of where the asset lies, exactly what components it has, which gives us a very true value of the average flood risk, or storm risk, or heat risk, or wildfire risk. And again, strategies, this comes from our big Infratech database that can map any given type of asset to all the available strategies, which gives us a physical risk score. So now I've done this, right? I have successfully quantified the risk exposure for transition risk and physical risk for infra assets, and I've told you how much it's going to cost because all of this is done in financial metrics. But there's still one thing that's missing. So I have all of these values, I have all of these dollar numbers, and I have all of these different things across the world. But I still don't have them on a comparative scale. I still don't have them in a way where I can pick up a solar plant in one part of the world, a wind farm in another part of the world, a coal plant in another part of the world, and probably a toll road somewhere else, and tell you, okay, this is how these assets compare with risk and exposure. This is where our next piece of work comes in, scientific climate ratings, which picks up these assets, looks at these risks, and puts them together in a very comparative way globally and across sectors. I will just give you an overview of what these ratings are and show you an example. So it follows the same process, right? You have your transition risk rating, which uses your policy risk score and reputation risk score combined into a weight. Use your physical risk ratings, which combines your flood risk, storm risk, heat risk, and wildfire. And eventually, you have the overall rating, which combines transition risk and physical risk. And this is, again, based on years and years of knowledge and years of information that we have collected about the infrastructure sector. Like it holds reported data, science-based models, NGFS scenarios, because we can do this not only today, but also for any given climate scenarios that you have. It includes press articles, it includes sentiment analysis, a lot of satellite information, and a lot of big databases. And this is an example of a solar power project, right? So when you look at this, you have two different sets of information. So if you compare it to all types of infrastructure, so if you compare the solar plant to roads and trains and power projects and network utilities and pipelines, you see that this project actually has a rating of C, where it's not very clear on the screen, but the average rating of the infrastructure asset class is at E. So you're much better off than the average infra asset. And when you compare it to your benchmarks, you remember that TICS, the big classification of 101 types of assets? So I know this is classified under one bucket, and I know 30 other projects that are classified in the same bucket. So how does this perform against its peers? So again, the average is E, and I have C. Now, I know the big debate about combining things and weighting things and how they don't give the true information and how this information can be misconstrued and how averages are flawed, et cetera. I know, I understand. That's why this is also presented independently. So for each item in each category, there is an independent score. So for this particular asset, you know, it's doing great in flood risk, it's doing great in heat risk, probably not so much in storm risk, which makes sense. It's a solar plant. Solar plants are susceptible to winds and hurricanes. They're often located in open spaces, which are probably hotspots for these type of events. And finally, policy risk, again, scope 1 and 2 emissions, you expect that for a solar farm. It's going to be A. But also it shows for this particular plant, your reputation risk is C. It's averaged. Maybe it has very high scope 3 emissions. Maybe it does something. Maybe it's this particular company is receiving bad press from somewhere. So you can put all of this information together and condense it into something now that's usable by investors, now that's usable to drive financial decisions. So if I just summarize my ratings, why? Again, systematic, objective, parsimonious. It puts together everything collectively in an understandable format. It has an extensive coverage. So as of the moment, we cover 5,000 plus assets under these ratings. And finally, it works very similarly to credit ratings, but it's also very different from other ESG scores that are primarily impact-driven. This is primarily takes a risk perspective because it's built for investors to deal with infra risk. And how do we do this? Again, we have models which are scientifically robust. We have tested them, validated them, thrown them under the bus, and we've seen how they go. We've incorporated company-specific strategies, so it doesn't only account for systematic risk, but also idiosyncratic risk. And finally, we don't look at this only today, but we can also do this in the future. So we can tell you what your rating looks like and how it evolves to 2030, 2050, whatever time horizon you want to look at. And most importantly, data quality scores. Now, my whole presentation has been very heavy on data. We've used thousands of data points to create these ratings, and it's great if this data exists. And I showed you in the beginning that only 16% of people think that this data exists. And I know this problem is real. We've been collecting this data. This data probably exists in some places and doesn't. We have to estimate it. We have to use assumptions. So what do we do in this case? We are very transparent about it, right? For every single input that goes into my model, I give it a data quality score. So if it's reported, great, it gets a good score. If it's reported and verified, even better. If I've estimated it based on the complexity of my model, I give it a moderate score. So this lets the investor look at this information and also understand what the credibility and the relevance of this data set is for them. And finally, back here. We are here. We are in a state of climate emergency. Adaptation, mitigation is now old. Well, it's not old, but mitigation is important, but so is adaptation. Yesterday, when I was listening to the COP session at Baku, they were talking about how you need to shift your priorities and your thought process and your focus from mitigation to adaptation. But the thing is, in order to do this, you have to know how. And specifically for infra, right? It is so big. It is so difficult, and the it's also, there's so much inertia in these solutions to actually manifest, for this to improve, that you have to really think about this. You have to do this properly, and infra lies at the heart of it all, right? You have infrastructure failure from climate action failure. It's going to give you a water crisis. It's going to give you extreme weather. It's going to have a lot of social problems. It is something that needs to be done. And interestingly, it also holds a very high benefit cost ratio. So for example, if you look at it, every dollar invested in infrastructure gives you a $13 return. And for companies that have actually implemented these strategies, this is a big report from the World Economic Forum, which said that collectively they invested about $7 billion, and they've seen returns of $180+ billion. So it's a no-brainer, right? But the thing is that for an investor, they don't see these returns. These are public returns. These are socioeconomic returns. It goes to independent people. But while we work our case, we try to convince investors to invest in something more sustainable. I would like to bring a call of action here. Like, how can you take away something from here? And I hope you can. I hope I've inspired you a little bit to see that even though this is a complex problem, and the solutions are complex, difficult, technically challenging, but they exist. And yes, we can wait for better data and better information, but we don't have that kind of time. We have to act. We have to do something now. So using what you have, knowing that this has high benefit cost ratios, not only for you, but for your firms, for the society, what can you do about it? Can you take back something in your firm, in your organization? And if you look at infrastructure, please come talk to me after. I'll help you to do this for your asset class. Thank you. Questions, sorry. I'm happy to take questions, not only from Menti, but also from the floor. That intimidating, that confusing, or that clear? I'm not sure. All right, after Qinyu then.
Testing. Okay, great. So now we're moving on to the second part, what I call the true cause of climate change continued. So my name is Qinyu, and also a quick clarification. I don't have a PhD yet, but maybe soon in the future, who knows. But I'm a sustainability data scientist, and what I focus on is the quantification of physical risk. That's my domain. But of course, as Nishtha has kindly set the stage for us and told us about all the context about why climate risk matters and why we should have a call for action, I will share today in detail about physical and transition risk, because together they combine and make climate risk. And I will take your hand and go step by step, every step of the way, to give you an example of how do we actually come up with these numbers. And with that, and combine these two very complex ideas into the single language I believe all humans know, which is in monetary terms. Tell anybody $1, $2, they know how much that cost. And so let's start by diving deep, and I literally mean it, by diving deep into a lot of water, which is the October 2024 Spain floods. Why I wanted to bring this up is because so far we have been talking about costs, about damages. They don't feel very real, so I'd like to show you what do these damages look like. So here is an example of the before and after the 2024 October Spain floods. And you can see here, I have a pointer. So this is the Spain city of Valencia. And in 8 hours, they received a year's worth of rainfall. This is definitely brought about more intense due to climate change. And here you see the flooded area. And here's what you see when you zoomed in. Entire roads being flushed out. And then you see piles and piles of cars being blocking entry to highways and even flooding entire, instead of road, is literally a road filled with cars. So these are the very real damages brought about by big events like Spain floods. But not sure about you, before I joined this sustainability field, I always see such graphic images and I go, yeah, but they're overseas. Yeah, Singapore's pretty safe, right? So in terms of catastrophic flood, what I can think of that ranks pretty high on the dramatic list in Singapore's context is the Orchard Road flooding of 2010. Back then, I was a kid still, and Orchard Ion here just finished building. And then all of a sudden, the roads were flooded. It was so dramatic. It was all over the news. But interestingly, you don't see that happen at all in the news nowadays. Not at all. And why is that? The answer lies in the theme of today, which is actually resilient measures. Our National Water Board agency, PUB, they actually put in place pretty good resilient measures, and immediately in the aftermath of that, they started working on the Stanford detention tank. Essentially, this is a detention tank that they dug deep underground and can hold up to 15, if I recall correctly, 15 Olympic pools size of water. At the same time, they started very quickly enforcing resilient measures, such as asking new structures to be built at above a certain sea level, and as well as asking all new roads to be built with flood walls, for example, around the region. So as a result, you don't really see flooding in Orchard Road anymore. It's a thing of the past. But, okay, so you have a point. It rarely happens in Singapore. We're lucky because we have a government who cares about resilience and who acts quickly and efficiently. But with the fact that climate change is set to increase the intensity, as well as the frequency of it happening, are we really safe? So here I'd like to share with you a personal experience that I had maybe just 2 months back on 17 September 2024. So I'm a person of routine. Every Tuesday after work, I take my yoga mat and I go to a HIIT class. My office is in Raffles CBD area, and that day I was crossing through Capital Spring to the Lau Pa Sat area. And very quickly, the sky turned dark, okay? And what happened next? I remember. So the sky turned dark, the wind became very, very angry. And from this point onwards, I felt like I was a heroine in an action movie, right? I'm Angelina Jolie, so let me demonstrate what happened. I started running. And then, like in an action movie, the bullets misses you, right? So in my case, instead of bullets, what happened was the tree branches started falling around me. Left, right, front, back, and I ran for my life. And what happened after that was not normal, and I waited for the news to show me what was the actual event the next day. And this is what we now know today as the Sumatra squall. So this is the actual footage, what I took after I ran to safety. I actually ran across the zebra crossing. And you can see that the tree branches, thankfully tree branches are not huge, and they were all over the floor in front of me, and the wind was just strong. So Sumatra squall, for context, is a line of thunderstorms that forms very suddenly and very violently in the Sumatra region of Indonesia. That's why it's known as Sumatra squall. And they blow over eastward to Singapore. And it's very hard to predict such events. They happen very suddenly, and in Singapore's case, in a matter of minutes. And what we know afterwards is that the maximum wind gust was around 83 kilometers per hour. And what about the damages? So the newspaper started reporting the next day there were about 300 trees being uprooted just within an hour. And 2 people were injured because of flying debris brought about by the very strong wind gust, and the ceiling actually cracked at the UOB Plaza. And this hit the home run for me, because as I was walking home from this area that I was taking shelter, I actually heard ambulance. So the next day, when I saw that 2 people were injured, I was like, oh, that makes sense now. I was, at the end of the day, very lucky. So here's an interesting food for thought. If this happened in Singapore at 83 kilometers per hour, how much worse could it have gotten if it was just 5 kilometers faster? And if you take a step back, what happens if it's a hurricane, cyclone, typhoon level? Of course, it won't happen in Singapore due to our lucky geographical location, but spare a thought about all those communities and all those people who have to endure such a strong, strong wind for days even, as it travels through and makes landfall in entire countries. And the maximum wind gust is at at least 119 kilometers per hour. So the estimated damage is likely going to be very severe and catastrophic, right? In just that 1 hour that we see, we already saw 300 trees, 2 people injured, grass roof damage. What if it's something stronger? So this is a question that we ask ourselves very often here in Scientific Infra, and we want to understand, what would that number be? How would it look like? So this is where Ms. Shah shared earlier. This is the paper that we've done. It's getting physical, and we published it last year in August. And the number that we came to is, in the worst case scenario, what we call the hothouse scenario, you will lose about, investors in infrastructure will lose about 54% of their portfolio value. And I'm going to walk you through every step as to how do we actually derive this particular number. And similarly, because we're talking about climate risk, we also did this study called The Highway to Hell that we also published last year, and we found this value to be about $600 billion of loss just to transition from a low carbon, from our current economy, state of the economy, to a low carbon economy. So again, I will go through step by step, how do we actually do this? Without further ado, this is physical risk and our methodology. So to start us off, there are two ways to go about quantifying physical risk. The approach is mainly top-down approach or bottom-up approach. Top-down approach refers to you trying to get very macro view of things. You try to get macro view and estimate the physical risk for one country, for a scale as big as a country. On the other hand, the bottom-down approach is where you start zooming in down to the asset level, and then you try to understand for this particular asset, what is the risk to it? What is the flooding risk? What is the wildfire risk? And then when you have that methodology established for each asset, the beauty of this methodology is that you can then combine it, and then you can start zooming out and do all these bigger kind of analysis. So this is what we opted for, the bottom-up approach. So, apologies, my throat is a bit scratchy. Oh yeah, I have some water. Apologies. So in this asset level approach, we start, of course, with the asset. We start by finding out where is this asset located. So the example that I've chosen here is Brisbane Airport. And here in Scientific Infra, we actually maintain a very comprehensive list of information about infrastructure assets. So in here, Brisbane Airport, what we do next is to find out, Google it. Where is it? What are its characteristics? How many runway does it have? It's an airport, right? And then we go to Google Maps. Oh, this is exactly the point where this asset is located. This is its geographical footprint. And then afterwards, we proceed to painstakingly extract the shape of this asset. It is done programmatically. It works for some assets. Others that not so easy is drawn by hand. And then afterwards, we need to start taking into account other ingredients. So I like to describe this process as, imagine you are making a cookie. You start with the cookie dough, right? The most important ingredient is the flour, and that is our location of the asset. Afterwards, you start adding other things to make your dough nice. And one of the key ingredient to that is what we call the hazard information. And in this case, this is a flood hazard map. What it tells you is basically in different shades of blue. The darker the blue, the higher the water level is when that flood occurs. And this is actually modeled by climate scientists, and we do obtain this from various sources, private as well as public. And at this point in time, I want to do a quick exercise, right? Because we're talking about physical risk. It's all about physically exercising it. So given the map legend, where blue, lightest blue is about 50-meter accumulation of water, all the way to the darkest blue, which is about more than 500 cm of water being accumulated, which map do you think corresponds to a 30-year return period flood map? Is it the left or the right? And which map also corresponds to a 100-year return map for flood? Any quick answers you want to shout? Is it the left for 30-year or the right for 30-year? Any guesses? Right is? Sorry. Okay, 30-year. Just tell me left or right. 30-year, left or right? Left. Okay. So 100 years right? Okay, you are right. So what are the telltale signs? The telltale signs is that a 100-year flood has more darker blue, and a 30-year flood has less darker blue. Why? Because a return period, conceptually, measures the magnitude of a hazard event, right? The higher the return period means that it is more severe, but at the same time, because it's so severe, it doesn't happen very frequently in the history. And therefore, a 100-year return period, by definition, is that it is a more severe event, and therefore it should have more darker blue areas. And with that, you will see me giving you examples of the two return periods after this. So, onwards to the next step. Oh yeah, before that, I want you to notice that you see here that the Brisbane airport seems to be covered entirely by water in the event of flood happening, right? But as what my colleague Nishtha has mentioned earlier, you being exposed to water doesn't translate to you being definitely damaged by water. And how do we know that? The concept behind that is exposure and vulnerability. So, and how do we actually translate that in damage terms? And the answer is damage functions. So damage functions are mathematical equation, essentially created by climate scientists for very localized study for specific area in the world. So what they do is they take into consideration, in the case of flood, the topography of an area, meaning whether this place is high or this place is low, is it mountainous, is it flat? And at the same time, they also consider things like soil porosity, how much water can the soil hold, and they sometimes also consider the building code, because certain areas, like Singapore, we do have very strong building codes that must take into account you must build your road at a certain level. Otherwise, you don't build the road. You don't get grants for it. And as a result, they are able to mathematically draw out and model this relationship and tell you that for each cm increase in the hazard, so in our case, flood, for 1 cm increase, what is the corresponding increase in damage expected for particular assets? And they can do it for many different asset types. So in this case, you see here, for flood damage function, for agriculture, which is the green line, you see that it's pretty steep because agriculture is typically made up of wooden stuff. Once submerged in water, it's basically rotten. On the other hand, for personal dwelling, for example, the yellow line here is actually a lot more resilient because structures are typically concrete. There's a higher chance it might survive a flood incident. So last step here is to add the sprinkler in your door, and in this case, financial information from our database. And the value that we want here is total asset value. It represents the total value of all the assets that a company has, or in this case, the total value of Brisbane Airport. This will help us be able to translate it into a financial cost later. So now with the dough mixed up everything, it's time to make the cookie. And the cookie outcome of this whole cookie exercise is what we call the physical damage at risk. When we have the asset, we overlay it with the hazard map, and then we put in the flood depth for each pixel of the asset that is covered in water. We convert it into the estimated damage done to the asset at the pixel level. And so I will explain what each of these metrics do. So pardon the, different sizing of the thing. The idea is not so much about the numbers, but the concept behind how we derive these values. Because at the end of the day, you can plug and play a different type of asset. What remains the same is the methodology. So the numbers are here just for example. So as I explained earlier, by putting in all the various inputs for each asset, we are able to derive the estimated percentage damage to a particular asset. In this case, this is what we call the PDAR, the percentage of asset area that is exposed and vulnerable to the hazard, or in other words, the percentage damage to the asset. As you can see here, the return period of 30-year, the number is about 17%. For 100-year, the number is about 23%. So again, I want to highlight that previously you saw the entire Brisbane airport being flooded, but only the actual damage that you need to repair and replace is about 17 and 23% for each of these flood intensity. Then next, we convert that percentage to an actual value cost that you need to repair or replace. You multiply that by the total asset value, and the estimated amount is about 934 million and 1,200 million respectively. And then we move on to the annualized cost of flood, which is a tricky concept. So let me explain it. Annualized cost of flood means that by virtue of an asset existing, thankfully, we don't always get hazards approaching. But it doesn't mean that the flood won't occur, right? So you actually need to consider, by you existing today, what is the cost, what is the probability of you having a 100-year flood? So to calculate this value, we annualize the cost of it by multiplying with the probability of the event occurring. So for a 100-year flood, the probability of it occurring at any one point in time is 1%, 1 over 100. For a 30-year flood, the probability of it occurring at any point in time is 1 over 30, which is about 3%. And a quick caveat, It's a common misconception to say that a 100-year flood happens only one every 100 years. That is wrong. It just means that it's so rare that history shows that, yeah, it's about one every 100 years. But your chance of getting a 100-year flood today is the same as tomorrow. You could be extremely unlucky that you get struck by a 100-year flood today and tomorrow, or you could be extremely lucky, which is most of the time, the flood doesn't happen. But in any case, with an annualized cost of flood, you get a metric that kind of tells you that by you existing in that location, that is a cost that you're expecting on a yearly basis. So that's what this means. And then the last of all, annualized cost across all return period. Here is a simple integral. We have from our database many return periods, from 10 all the way to 10,000. We calculate a value for each return period, and we put it under integral function for people to understand what is my overall cost of flood. And of course, we also do that for other types of hazards, overall cost of wildfires, overall cost of extreme heat stress. So that's just another metric to help investors understand inherently their asset risk. So with that in mind, I'd like to bring the topic back to the idea of resilience, right? You don't just sit there and be a passive worker waiting for things to happen to you. Companies might opt for resilience measures, and there are ways for us to adjust the calculation. So here's the previously calculated values. And to adjust for resilience, we must first have evidence that a company is doing some resilient activities. In this case, Brisbane Airport, they have mentioned in their sustainability report that they are embarking on elevation and flood barriers measures. But that's all that they mention. They don't tell you how effective it is. That information comes from the Nishtha and her colleagues' work, which is from our Infra tech. From there, we actually studied all the different possible types of resilient measures, and we study how effective they might be. So in this case, for elevation, by increasing the elevation of your assets, by putting more land under it, raising your profile, it's estimated to be effective for at least 80% for hazard events that are of magnitude 100 years or lesser. So in this case, we then change the values and make it, and is reduced correspondingly as a result, because this applies for a 100-year flood and below. But whereas flood barriers is for coastal flood, in this example, we're only focusing on inland flood, so no adjustment made. But at the end of the day, if you don't do this quantification in the first place, it's very hard for you to understand the impact of your resilient measures. So next up, I want to answer this question of sanity. You have all these numbers. Does it really make sense? How does it measure up in actual events? So here, we give you the example of the 2023 Italy floods that just happened, I think, 1 year before the Spain floods. Unfortunately, it's a thing now that you see very major floods every other year or every other month. But that's the state of world that we're in. I don't have a lack of examples to show you. But here, Italy floods is one that we managed to do some actual quantification of the actual damage. So here's example of how bad it was. And interesting fact, this particular flood, they received about half a year's worth of rain over 36 hours. And here, from the newspaper itself, there were 4 key regions that were affected: Bologna, Ravenna, Florisesna, and Rimini. And we have overlaid that regional map with what our 100-year models have predicted to be the extent of the flood. So anything shaded in black is the actual, is the model extent of a 100-year flood. And when we compared it with what was being reported in the news, our data indeed show the same information, which is, of all the 4 affected areas, Ravenna region is the worst affected area. So our model information itself lines up. Then we overlay the actual extent of the flood found in Copernicus. And so the actual extent of the flood is shaded in blue. Just by a quick visual comparison, you will know that actually there are a lot of black areas that are not shaded in blue, covered by blue. This tells us that the key takeaway is that the flood that actually happened isn't even as bad as the actual, or rather as a modeled 100-year flood event. So while you see very sensational headlines like, oh, flood of a century, it's actually not really. It could have been worse. This was less than a century. And we apply the same methodology as I've just described to you. so we extracted every single road, highway, and major secondary road, and we applied a damage function of road to it and estimated the cost needed, or rather estimated the cost done by the, by the flood itself. The whole value turned out to be 92 million of euros. How does that compare with actual estimates by their local authorities? So we found this article by Money IT, a local newspaper, in which they interviewed local officials, and they estimated that the repair cost in Ravenna itself, specifically to roads, would cost about 120 to 150 million of euros to fix. So what's our takeaway here? Our takeaway is, number one, the values that we calculate is not that different, and in fact, with a more robust approach, a more scientific approach, and a more asset-level approach, we are able to derive a more smaller value that is a little bit more realistic in our opinion. And of course, to tie it back to the concept or the idea of resilience, which is why we're here today, let's do an interesting thought experiment. We have just shared that the estimated cost of a 100-year flood in the Ravenna region is about 92 million euros. So what if the government then decide that, yeah, it's about time we do something to change this? How about we start building flood walls? And based on the work, again, done by Nishtha and colleagues, Connor, if you start building a flood wall, assuming that you build up to the standards that we say, it has an efficacy of 95%, right? Your value will drop by 95%, and the build cost is 0.06. So it builds the case that we should start investing in resilient measures. And at the same time, at a very affordable cost compared to the grand scheme of things. So, and underlying it all, you know, to drive that point across, everything that's fueling this quantification, you can't convince people to start investing in resilience without first quantifying physical risk. And which is what we've done here. We've demonstrated that when you understand the specific cost to it, you are able then to start telling people that, yeah, you know, when you do this, you can save this amount of money. You can start trying to change the state of the world that we're in. That's what we're hoping to do so. And with that, I take a sip of water and open up for any questions for physical risk, if you have. Oh, there's still transition risk. I'm not done yet.
I have one question, sorry.
Yes.
We talked about some assets being, the shapes being drawn by hand.
Yes.
Can you give some examples, please?
Can I use some examples? So the very complex assets that we often find is ports. Those are massive. They span a few acres, and sometimes they come in different shapes. And if you're familiar with, okay. Would you like to repeat the question in case they didn't hear you?
Apparently, I have to.
Yeah.
You talked about certain assets which have to be hand-drawn. Can you
Yeah.
maybe cite some examples, please? Thank you.
Yes. So to answer that question again, one example I can think of is port assets, the seaports, bulk good ports, etc. Because what happened for these assets is that they're huge. They span sometimes a tip of an island. Other times, in terms of land use maps, they're often classified as industrial. But you do see that actual footprint sometimes, if you dig up a document from the company, they'll say that no, it's way bigger. It's not just there. I do have supporting structures. So that is not something that programmatically can be done that easily. There needs to be a lot of fine-tuning, and therefore, most of such assets, we do draw them by hand, by verifying the different extent of evidence of the asset boundary that we can find. Yeah. Okay, we have a second question. We need the mic.
Hello?
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about your 30 and 100-year projections. When
Sure.
you do those, what kind of global climate scenario do you assume for them? Is it like a 3 degrees or 4 degrees scenario?
Very good question. So right now, every values that I am sharing with you right now is done for baseline scenario, which is as of today. Later on, as I round up the discussion at the end of transition risk, we will touch upon climate scenarios. That is the work done by my colleague Bertrand, where he takes both our physical risk and transition risk, factors in the scenario to give you an overall cost. Yeah, so wait for it. We have one more question?
a graph that showed the agricultural impact was very high.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you said physical infrastructure made out of wood, are you then not counting the actual agricultural land? What happens to the soil? What happens to the watershed? Is that not counted as infrastructure for you? And is
So-
that loss not calculated?
Right. Thank you for the question. For now, the damage function, the way it does, is specific to the asset type. So yes, indeed, we are referring to specific structure on that land. The cost, the damage done to the land, is a different type of damage that we are not covering as yet. Because at the end of the day, we started this whole exercise wanting to convince investors that their assets are at risk. And unfortunately, investors, they care more about their asset more than the land underneath it. But of course, we hope to be able to extend the research into that more into the future. All right, so I think let me continue on to the next part, transition risk, and then I'll wrap it up and we can have more questions if we have time. Oh, okay, I guess we don't have time. Okay, so very quickly then, towards transition risk, I would like to say that this is the part where I'm standing on the shoulders of giant. This is my colleague's Fabien's work, and he is here with us today. If you have any tough questions, please direct that to him. No, I'm kidding. We are happy to answer any questions. But here's a quick overview of transition risk and how we do it. So, is that working? That is not working. Okay. So our approach essentially models carbon emission based on greenhouse gas protocol. And what greenhouse gas protocol does is that it gives you the framework on how you can quantify carbon emission, or how you can estimate carbon emission. And for our case, we strictly use carbon taxes to proxy the exposure to transition risk. What this means is that in this approach that I just mentioned here, we cover the policy risk. I know that Nishtha just said that we do reputation risk. That is true, but the examples that I'm showing you is only for policy risk only. At the same time, this is related to the value that we'll be sharing later, the $600 billion paper that is built upon this methodology. And covering reputational risk, that's a very exciting new approach. And if you're interested to reach out to us, we would love to share more about that particular approach. So when talking about transition risk, the key concept to know is Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And in the context of airports, here's some quick examples. We have direct emission related to whatever that's happening within the asset itself. So in the context of airport, Scope 1 is things like using oil for heating in your terminals. Scope 2 is indirect emission for electricity purchase. So for example, keeping the lights on in your terminal. That comes from a power plant outside of the airport boundary, typically. Scope 3 is what we call the mother of all emissions. It covers basically all the upstream and downstream activities related to an airport. So for example, when your passenger commutes from their home to the airport, that's considered under Scope 3. So with that said and done, let's go into the methodology. And once again, we use back the same asset, Brisbane Airport. And in transition risk, what information do we need for our models? So firstly, again, apologies for the misskilled table. We basically get a total of 5 financial metrics from our Infometric database. So our Infometric database, we contain a lot of infrastructure assets as well as all of their financial metrics. So the 5 metrics that we need is total asset value, net asset value, enterprise value, revenue, as well as EBITDA. Essentially, they're all different measures. The first 3 are measures of asset size. The last 2 are measures of revenue and profitability from the activities of a company. And I'll explain shortly how we use all these values to quantify transition risk. And next up, for our models, we need sustainability reports. We first trawl through whether there is sustainability reports, and we extracted Scope 1 and 2 emissions. As what my colleague Nishtha has mentioned, we don't extract Scope 3 emissions even if they report it. Reason being, we have seen enough sustainability reports to know that not all companies report the same. I've even seen examples where they say Scope 3 bracket only within the company's operation. They don't consider what's outside of it. So that's essentially Scope 1 and 2 masquerading as Scope 3, which is wrong. Which is why we will be estimating Scope 3 emissions ourselves in-house using our models. So to do that modeling, we actually need more information. So in the example of airports, we do find a lot of other complementary factors to help us do our modeling. So we have number of flights, landing and takeoff time, etc. So here's an example of how do we do our modeling. So for scope 1 and 2, they go through the regression model. Scope 3, it goes through what we call the physical models. So for regression model, it's possible because of reported emissions. The sustainability reports, sometimes they come with some years of scope 1 and 2, other years they don't, sometimes because they haven't started tracking back then. So for us to have a complete picture, we'll either do a forward or backward interpolation to derive carbon emissions. And it's important to not just do a linear interpolation because things change. So for example, we take into account the number of flights because in 2020, there's COVID. There's literally nothing flying, so there's no emission. So you need that to ground your estimation. At the same time, for scope 3, because we're estimating this ourselves, it's very important to list down all the activities that the company do, operationally, for consumption, for production. And with each of these activities, we then estimate how much carbon emission that they're going to emit. And with that, here's a sample example of how we do this calculation. So here's in the context of an airplane. The cruise distance is total traveled distance. We convert that into number of fuel used for that distance, and then multiply by emission factor, which is for every liter of fuel, how much emission is given out as a process, as well as at the landing and takeoff time. So it's really the entire airplane going to the airport for just one part of activity of an airport. So that's how we estimate scope 3 and do this for every other type of activities that we can find and have data for. So with that, we are able to calculate the carbon emissions for the company, and from there, we actually built all the other financial metrics on top of it. So let me go through very quickly what this means. So carbon emission, scope 1, 2, 3, we have it, and we call it the absolute carbon emissions, meaning that it's supposed to comprise of all the different types of emission sources. And for this particular example, the number turns out to be 460, 35,000, and 1.8 million ton of carbon equivalent. Then next, we need to introduce the concept of carbon intensity. Why? Because scope 1, 2, 3 calculated is unique to the asset because of the specific size of the airport, because of the specific number of flights. You can't really compare it with a bigger or smaller airport. They're just not comparable. So in order to make them comparable, we then need to calculate carbon intensity, which is essentially emission per dollar of asset size. Asset size can be net asset value, EVIC, and total asset. They're just different variation of total asset. Or emissions per dollar of performance. So in this case, revenue. And with that, when you do it to per dollar, then you can start comparing between companies. Next, we have the concept of EBITDA at risk. This is where we jump from baseline scenario to incorporate future carbon scenarios. So here, EBITDA at risk is the impact of future carbon tax increases on the operating cash flow of a company. And we derive this based on a disorderly transition scenario. So here I'd like to spend some time to talk about climate scenarios. And for this orderly transition scenario, my favorite analogy of it is me as a kid in school. I have an assignment, I have a deadline, I often procrastinate until the very last minute, and then I decide to work on it. So similarly, for this orderly transition scenario, that's the state of the world. We have a deadline to go to net zero by 2050, so that the world doesn't warm beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. But where we are at now, that's not very possible. And in fact, as the optimist in us believe that the most probable scenario is disorderly, where we'll actually spring into action and start imposing some of these carbon taxes more rapidly after 2030, so that we can still reach the climate goal, right, to 1.7 degrees instead, and not let it spiral out of control so that we reach destruction of the world. So we estimate this in the context of this orderly transition. So next is transition risk, which we define as the difference between the NAV, net asset value, with carbon tax, the maximum, and without carbon tax. So essentially, same thing, we apply it in this orderly transition because that is the cost of transiting. If you transit in a disorderly fashion, you're gonna get a lot of tax towards the end, and that's the estimated cost that we have. Again, this is the summary of all the values that we have derived. Again, the key is the concept, how we do it. The numbers are just to exemplify it. So same thing for transition risk. There's also decarbonization efforts that a company can choose to take on. And we do account for it. If we can find information of the decarbonization measures, we can then adjust the values accordingly. So in this case, Brisbane Airport also mentioned that they have these two measures for their Scope 3 to help reduce their Scope 3 emission. So firstly, they try to purchase renewable energy generation outside of their premises, and they also try to purchase low carbon fuels. And again, they only state that they do this too. We need to combine it with information from our Infra database. Then we can try to convert that and see how it changes the Scope 3 emission. So based on our Infratech database, we know that typically such renewable energy generation, they have an efficacy of 80%, and they account for typically 3.81% of the overall Scope 3 emissions being generated by a company. So when we do the math, we multiply them together and add it up, that would then reduce the Scope 3 emissions to about 1.1 million instead of the original 1.8 million. So lastly, this is where everything combines together in climate scenarios. And I'll just spend some time talk about this table here first. So again, I've mentioned delayed transition. When we add physical risk and transition risk together, what we do is, because it's future, we don't know how it actually changed. So our assumption here is that in the orderly and delayed transition, because we start transitioning to a lower carbon economy, the impact then on the climate is not as severe, and the physical risk will not spiral as badly. So the physical risk is kind of kept on the lower side when we do the projection. On the other hand, if we have no transition, it's business as usual, it's the worst case scenario, we don't do anything to reduce our transition, then we will have very, very high physical risk. But the transition risk is low because we don't do anything. There's no cost involved. So that is the basis of our modeling. And when we add both of this together, the climate scenarios themselves also come with macroeconomic projections, which we then fit into our models to see how it changes between each scenario. And then we can estimate the carbon emission and physical risk of each asset for each scenario until 2050. So as a conclusion, I'm ending. Thank you for staying with me. When we apply all of these methodology into our universe of infrastructure assets, we have about 9,000 over assets costing about $4.1 trillion. When we apply all of these methodology asset level all the way to each one of them, that's how we are able to come up with the values that I showed you earlier. Negative 54% for physical risk, and that's the worst in the hothouse scenario where we don't do anything. And now back to the $600 billion, this is how we calculate it, because we modify it according to different, and we found that the total value is about $600 billion. So I'd just like to end here. I think it's a good summary of all the metrics that we just covered. And we actually do them in a lot of variations. In no transition, this orderly transition scenarios, we have it for multiple time horizons, also for many physical risk hazard types. So thank you for sitting here with us.